I am Liz Pankel. I'm the Dean of Libraries. Some of you I've met, some of you I haven't. So hopefully after this we can chat a little bit. We are honored to host the Frank and Virginia Williams series on Abraham Lincoln and Civil War studies. To welcome everyone formally to this event, I'd like to introduce our MSU president, Dr. Mark Kadam.
Thank you, Dean Pankel, and I do feel like we just may have had the program right here, the introduction just a moment ago. But I do want to officially welcome all of you here with us this afternoon. As you just heard Dean Pankel mention, this is the 5th annual Frank and Virginia Williams lecture series on Abraham Lincoln and Civil War studies. And how fortunate we are to have such a lecture series. And it's because of the gentleman that you see over my left shoulder and his generosity, he and his wife, Virginia, and what they've been able to do as far as their commitment and support for Mississippi State and their love for this university. And when you think about what they have contributed and done for Mississippi State in this realm as far as Abraham Lincoln and Civil War studies, where you can just go up the stairs, one flight, and you see the unbelievable Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library, which is the home of the Frank and Virginia Williams collection on Lincolniana. At the time, it was at one time the nation's largest privately held collection of Abraham Lincoln artifacts, memorabilia, historical documents, and that resides here in the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library. The Presidential Library, the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library itself is here because of Frank Williams and his leadership. And this gentleman I'm looking at right here on the second row, Dr. John Marzalak, and their efforts to bring this remarkable collection of history, of this important, pivotal history of our nation. And we are the center of the universe as far as scholastic studies and scholarship around this era of the years leading up to the Civil War itself and the years following, right here on our campus, and how blessed we are to have such an outstanding library center for scholarship and knowledge for all of our scholars, our history department, and all that we're able to do, use it for extensive research and for authors, and to come to our campus and study and learn and find history that's still in our documents that are being found and told and shared. And for our students to be able to have access to this as well. It's just remarkable, and I'm so honored and proud and pleased. And again, Frank and Virginia Williams were so instrumental in helping make all of this happen, and the support that they've provided not only for their collection, their donation, and all the things that they've done, but the fact that Frank Williams, he and Virginia are providing a gift for establishing an endowed faculty position for the study of Abraham Lincoln and Civil War studies right here on our campus. Just tremendous generosity, and we just can't say enough to thank Frank for how much we appreciate you. You know, he's Chief Frank Williams, retired Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for the great state of Rhode Island, and we refer to him as Chief Williams. Okay, he's the chief, and he is the chief. But he also has another title, which I'm also very proud that he owns. He's Dr. Frank Williams. He has his doctorate degree from Mississippi State University, the highest honor that our university can bestow upon an individual. Chief Dr. Frank Williams received that honor in 2018. So he's an alum of this university, and we're proud to claim him as that. And but we're just so proud and thankful for Frank and Virginia, and for sponsoring yet again, as I mentioned, this now the 5th of our lecture series for Civil War Studies, Abraham Lincoln and Civil War Studies. And we're very pleased that you're able to do all that you've done for us, Frank, and we're so grateful. So I'm going to step out of the way because I'm going to turn it to you and let you introduce our distinguished lecturer this afternoon, Dr. Alford, who we're so thrilled to welcome back to Mississippi State University. He too is a Mississippi State Bulldog with his doctorate degree from our great university. So with that, Chief Dr. Frank Williams, I will turn it to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Keenum, and for the kind things you had to say about me in Virginia and our commitment to the state. It's a genuine feeling for us because we get back from you and all of the alum and students and faculty and staff that exist because of state. And we get that feeling of what you are about progressively, and also the empathy that you have. That is why, and one reason why, we have our collections at State, and we have the Grant Presidential Library at State, because of all the good that you and the people with you do for our legacy and our history. And this is Mississippi, so it's not the same university it was, Terry, when you getting your PhD. It has come miles beyond what you remember when you were a PhD student here at State. So I want to say about Terry Alford just a couple of personal things. We have been friends for over a generation. You can read his bio, his short biography. There's more to it, as there is to him, in the program. But Terry Alford is a distinguished scholar, and I think in part because of the work he did in getting his PhD at State. And I know him as a great, skillful researcher and scholar that brought about the definitive biography of John Wilkes Booth. Now, there would not be many who would write about someone convicted of killing or the regicide of our President Lincoln. But he had the courage to do that, as he had the courage to do this latest book. There are copies for him to sign and you to purchase. I hope you will do that, about spiritualism involving the Lincolns, the Booths, and others in the mid-Victorian America. So without further ado, let me introduce and bring to the podium Dr. Terry Alford, who we so much admire, not only with his work, but for coming to deliver this lecture. Thank you, Terry.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you for that, that kind introduction and for the invitation to be here today. Frank is a very fine speaker himself, and I remember years and years ago, a friend of mine said, "Hey, Frank is giving a speech at Ford's Theater this afternoon. Why don't we go down after lunch?" And I said, "Really? What's he going to talk about?" And you may remember this. I think I've told you this story, Frank. Frank said he's going to talk about Ambrose Burnside. I said, "I don't know. That sounds a little depressing. You got, so come on, it's Frank. Let's go down, fly the flag." So we went down. And as I've told Frank, I'm glad to share this with his friends. That was one of the best speeches I've ever heard at Ford's Theater. I'm appreciative again for the invitation and glad to see such a nice-sized audience here. I see I won't be in the situation of the young poet. She published a book of poems and was just delighted be invited to come to the community center on a Friday night at 7 to read her new book. And she went, she was so excited, she went at 6:30 so she could meet people, sign copies and everything. At 6:30, there wasn't anybody there yet. At 6:45, there wasn't anybody there. At 7 o'clock, when the program was supposed to begin, there still wasn't anybody there, not even the person who invited her. Finally, at 7:05, someone came in, but he was the only person who came, but he sat all the way back by the exit. And of course, our good poet was mortified. She said, I can't believe this. I'm just going to go. No, I can't just go home. This one person came. So she stood up and she said, I think I'll just get started. Why don't you come down front so you can hear a little better? And he said, no, I'm going to sit back here. I have to slip out a little early. So I'm glad I won't be in her situation. As you heard, I am a graduate of MSU, and if you hear anything you like in the talk today, I guess the history department at that time deserves some credit. And if you hear something you don't like, they deserve the blame. I think it's only fair, to pass that around. But I was thinking on my way to campus today, this is only the second time I've been on campus in 50 years. You go someplace, and then that takes you some other place, and as the poet says, way leads on to way. And the years pass, but of course, they're very memorable years because I don't think there was a decade that exceeded turbulence. I know none exceeded it. I doubt if any equal the 1960s. I'd only been on campus a few weeks when Medgar Evers was shot, John F. Kennedy shot later that year, 3 civil rights workers the next year, Richard Holmes enrolled the year after that, then the King murder, the Robert Kennedy murder, and then Mississippi State's fledgling environmental and counterculture and anti-war movement of the late 60s. So, I have very strong memories of campus, particular spots on campus, certain hallways even. Most of the memories are pretty good. Some are, I don't know, a few are unsettling, but, it was certainly an interesting formative time. Now, you heard Frank say that I'd written a biography of John Wilkes Booth. It was a standard biography. I wrote it in the 4 stages of his life. Indeed, all of our lives actually have 4 stages. Stage 1, you believe in Santa Claus. Stage 2, you no longer believe in Santa Claus. Stage 3, you are Santa Claus. And stage 4, you look like Santa Claus. So those are the 4 stages of the Booth book. And in the process, I became aware that the Booths were really into spiritualism. It's been well known for generations, right, that the Lincolns were interested in this, particularly Mrs. Lincoln, to some questionable extent her husband. So I just decided that, I would take a look, and I was pretty surprised with what I found out. You can see this reads, please, I want to make sure you guys can, Liz and everybody can see the slides. House in which spiritualist wrappings originated. This small home is situated, or was situated, in Hydesville, New York. The Fox family lived there. Father, mother, some daughters, notably Maggie on the left here. And they began to say when they were teenagers that they were hearing and actually receiving messages from a murdered man who was buried in the basement of their family home. And they were telling this tale. Their mother believed them. The sister was convinced. The neighbors were intrigued. The next thing you know, they're giving this talk at the local church and the meeting house and in Quaker meetings in that part of New York State. And pretty soon other people were saying that they're hearing rapping noises that are coming, from the table, from the walls, from here, from there. And the Hummel Fox family house was transformed into this amazing thing. This is a pretty rare engraving known as the Dawning Light. And I know it's a little too small to see, but what we could tell if we could get closer are spirits are streaming from the heavens into the Fox family home, bringing messages from the dead. The basic message was the dead are ever present. I mean, they're right there. You just have to be sensitive enough to appreciate that. And they're very interested in counseling us, consoling us, being with us, telling us things about what's going to happen to us in life after death. The next thing you knew, these spiritualist meetings and seances were spreading across the entire United States. There were several different types of seances. I might make a distinction between the two principal ones in a second. But as the movement began to spread outside New York to the big cities, the Fox girls went to New York City. They held meetings. They're attended by hundreds and hundreds of people. Spiritualism spread certainly by 1850 to Springfield, Illinois. This is an early shot of that town. And the Lincolns had some connection, although it's a little bit uncertain from this period in their lives, with the movement. Now, this is the earliest known photograph of Abraham Lincoln, taken around 1846 or 47, when he was newly elected to Congress. He doesn't show any of the, in this photograph, he looks like a prosperous local merchant. He doesn't show, the rough and tumble life that he had in Kentucky and Indiana very well. That's all been smoothed and polished away, no doubt thanks to his fashion-conscious wife, Mary, who was very attuned to appearances, certainly hers and his too. Here's a companion photo to the one we just saw, the earliest known photo of her. Now, their connection, if any, with spiritualism in the pre-war years centered around this child, Eddie Lincoln, age 3, who died of pulmonary tuberculosis. Most likely. We don't have progressive era death records, right, for the pre-Civil War period. Only one or two places were keeping death records as we know them in the Civil War, even in the Civil War years. But when this child died, there's some stories that the Lincolns made an effort to contact his spirit through 3 wise, eccentric women who lived in Springfield. But again, this is very early, and it's poorly documented, to say the least. We can say this, that the Lincolns were, Mary and Abraham, very superstitious people. William Herndon, Lincoln's law partner, said Abraham Lincoln had a streak of spiritualism really deeply ingrained in him. Herndon expressed it like you can see, a streak of blue in a slab of marble or something like that. It was just fixed into him. And one of those superstitions that Lincoln had was he was superstitious about the number 13. Famous story of when he was joining some chums for lunch or dinner, and he realized he would be the 13th person at the table. And he said, I'll see you guys later. I'm not going to sit down and be 13. And someone there said, I'd rather be dead than be that superstitious. I mean, that really surprised his friends. Mary Lincoln was superstitious also. She was raised by the quintessential Southern Mammy. She calls in the records Mammy Sally. And Mammy Sally told her that every Friday, the devil made a list of everything bad you had done during the week. And the worse you'd been, the happier he was. He laughed, he slashed his tail around on the ground, and all your misdeeds were written down by his imps in a book, as they chronicle, your bad behavior as a child. Now, Friday, of course, that's a problematic day of the week, probably from the Good Friday connection, I would guess. But if you look in the records of this time, it's pretty clear that some planters would not plant crops on Friday. You wouldn't begin a long trip on Friday. You wouldn't sign an important legal paper on Friday. That Friday. That was just thought to be the one day that you needed to stay away from. Now, you'll notice something. A minute ago, I was speaking about spiritualism. Now I'm talking about superstition. Are those the same thing? And what is the connection between those things? I asked one of my class once if they could explain the difference between the two or what the difference was and put it in words. And I have a candid photo I took of the class when I asked them that question. I've noticed something about my students. When I ask a question, I have to ask it twice. The first time you ask students a question, they become aware that someone else is in the room with them. Okay. Then you have to repeat the question, at which time you may or may not get an answer. But Spiritualists in this time, like the Fox sisters and others, would say that they have absolutely nothing to do with superstition. That's silly stuff. Spiritualism cannot be superstition, they would say, because it's something that can produce observable effects. It can produce noises, it can produce sounds, it can produce, in some cases, actual apparitions, that it is modern, it is scientific, it rejects old-fashioned ideas like hell, it elevates the status of women, as professors of the movement, and on and on. It was progressive in its politics, it was always anti-slavery, that it had no paid clergy, everyone in attendance was equally likely perhaps to receive spiritualist messages. So they were very convinced that they had nothing to do with any silly superstitions. This is the childhood home of John Wilkes Booth. It's located north of Baltimore, Maryland. It's still there, now owned by Harford County, Maryland. A family unrelated to the Booths are posing on the porch, but they're a little bit in the way, in my opinion, but at least we've got a nice image of the house, and it still looks remarkably the same, I might say. The father of the Booth family is shown on the left here. This is Junius Brutus Booth Sr. This is the father of John Wilkes Booth and his brothers, like Edwin Booth, shown at age about 12 on the right there. Junius Brutus Booth Sr. was an actor like his sons John Wilkes and Edwin, and he had very strong feelings about the presence of spirits nearby to us when we were living, and in general, the sanctity of life. For example, he told John Wilkes and Edwin here that you couldn't kill anything. It was wrong to take any type of life. Animal life, certainly. Cattle, sheep, no, you couldn't kill those. Birds, absolutely not. Butterflies, no. Ants, no. Spiders, no. Disgusting, filthy, disease-prone rats, no. They're covered too. If it was alive, you had to respect that life and you had to leave it alone. Now, Junius Booth was the father was the teller of a famous story, The Ghost Dog. He had been down to perform in Petersburg, Virginia. The weather was very bad. He was unable to travel the night after the performance. So he and some pals were hanging out in a tavern, telling stories, reciting favorite poems. And Booth was reciting a poem by Byron. Byron had written as an homage to his dog, Botswain. This was a Newfoundland dog who had died of rabies. And Byron wrote some famous lines about the poem because Byron was concerned with something that Booth was concerned with too, and that was whether or not animals had souls. In other words, was Botswain going to meet him in heaven if Byron should be lucky enough to get there? So he wrote in his poem, the poem is, if you like to look it up online sometime, it's Epitaph to a Dog. Byron wrote the following of his dog, Botswain. The dog, in life the firmest friend, first to welcome, foremost to defend, whose honest heart is still his master's own, who labors, loves, fights for him alone, dishonored falls, unnoticed all his worth, denied in heaven the soul he held on earth. As the elder Booth was reciting those lines, the candles in the room went out. Booth's foot slipped off the fireplace jamb downward, and he hit a dog. Everyone swore the dog had not been there until the poem was being recited. No one had seen the dog, no one knew where it came from, no one claimed to own it or know anything about it. It had just appeared in the opinion of the elder Booth and the Booth family by occult sympathy, as the father put it. Now I might say, if I could back up to that slide, right here is a blurry little image. And of course, some people say that's the dog, the Booth family dog, who still appears as a ghost and protects the house after all these years. Others say it's just a hyperactive child running around and spoil the camera shot. This is John Wilkes Booth's mother. Her name is Mary Ann Holmes. She was given to dreams and visions. And interesting note, I noticed this, just happened to notice it, and then I saw it everywhere once I noticed it. She was afflicted with extropia. In other words, her left eye deviated outward. And it was often said for people with this condition that they were spiritually gifted because they saw in two different directions. In other words, they saw twice as much as anyone else. She was famous for her dreams, for her visions, for indeed her fireplace vision about John Wilkes Booth. He was a babe, maybe 6 months old. She was nursing him by the fireplace. And she was just, for some reason, filled with this anxiety to know what his future would be, or John Wilkes Booth's future would be when he was 6 months old. And she asked God to give her an answer to that. And she always told this story in her family. In fact, she told it so frequently that one of her daughters turned it into a poem, which we have, that the fireplace just flared up in front of her. And the word country appeared in the flames, she said. And then the flames died into the word John, the name of her son, the baby, the future assassin. And then the flames died down. And she took that to mean that he would have some future connected with, perhaps a violence with his country's history. And we all remember perhaps John Wilkes Booth was shot and mortally wounded in a burning barn. This was the young boy in the joint photo. This is Edwin Booth, John's older brother, also a famous actor. I can always tell roughly how old that Edwin is by his haircut, and that's an early 60, 61, 62 haircut for him. But he was born on this night in 1833, the night of the greatest Leonid meteor shower that was ever recorded. And I can tell you, if it was anything like this, it would have certainly caught my attention. This was the great meteor shower, Leonid shower in 1833. Abraham Lincoln saw it out in Illinois. Abraham Lincoln was a young man by that time, and Lincoln's landlord came running in and said, this is the end of the world. Look out here, look out. Lincoln came out and he saw the meteors. But then he noticed beyond them, the constellations were still fixed in their firmament. They weren't moving. Just the meteors close in, not the constellations. So Lincoln said, well, I think we'll linger a little while longer, right? I think it'll be okay. But the servants at the Booth farm said anyone born on a night like this, as the servants put it, was gifted to see ghosts. So that was the legacy that Edwin had. He also, by the way, was born with a caul on his face. And that happens very, very rarely, very rarely. But it means anyone who has a caul is lucky in life. And also one of the stories was that they could not be drowned. That was one of the advantages of having a caul. Now, Edwin was a very superstitious person. He was afraid of peacock feathers. He was afraid of ivy vines. I could spend the rest of the lecture telling you the things he was afraid of. But if you remember now, these people are actors. And I notice, and I say in the book, that I believe a lot of times people who have to perform under pressure are superstitious, like gamblers, actors, athletes, for example, right? That's a very, very probably common thing for those performance professionals. John Wilkes Booth was very superstitious. I always liked this photograph. This is the handsome Booth, as I say. I think it's one of his better photographs from about 1862 or 3, right in the middle of the Civil War years. I noticed something, though, in looking, I might say first, that he was given a reading by a fortune teller. Gypsies, so-called gypsies, more properly Romani, were making their way through the eastern U.S. in the early 1850s. And they made a living, one of their ways was buying and selling horses. So they often camped at a blacksmith shop near Tudor Hall, the Booth family home. And of course, they could read your fortune, if you crossed their palm, with a dime or something. So when they camped near the Booth family farm, he went down to John Wilkes to have his fortune read. You can guess how this is going to turn out. You don't need a history degree to know how this fortune is going to turn out. Now, of course, we have no photograph of his getting his fortune told, at least the woman who gave it to him. But, and one person or two in here might giggle when they see this image. This is Maria Osmanskaya, a great character actress from the 1930s. And this is a picture from the original Wolfman movie with Lon Chaney Jr. But she was handing out fortunes in that, so I just put her up, to symbolize what I'm speaking of. And she told John Wilkes Booth that she was sorry that he came by to see her, that she had never seen a worse hand in her life, that, he would have an absolutely terrible end to his life, that he would die alone, he would die friendless, he would live hard, live fast, be loved by many, but abandoned at the end. And John Wilkes, you tell a 12-year-old kid that, they don't know what to make of that or what to say. And he said, I got to pay you for that? I think you ought to pay me. I mean, I can't believe you're telling me this. And he said, is there any way I can get out of this? And she said, well, become a missionary maybe or something like that. I mean, I'm a little short of ideas to help you out. But it is the worst hand I've ever seen. And his sister Asia said, he came back, told her, she said, that old woman doesn't know what she's talking about. This is BS. I mean, you got to be kidding, right? This is nothing. Don't pay any attention to her. And he laughed it off, or did he? She said he never forgot that, and in later years, when something bad would happen to him, because he didn't get a call, when something bad would happen to him, he would recur to the old Romani fortune that he had heard. Comets were big omen things, as you might know, in the 19th century. One was seen the night before Caesar was assassinated, and later in the decade of the 1860s, when Tolstoy wrote War and Peace, he talked about this and put it in. Comets were thought to presage dramatic and very turbulent events. And in the summer of 1860, a meteor procession, where the meteor breaks up, streaked across New York City. And it was so close, some people thought it was fireworks. I mean, it was absolutely amazing. It was right above the city. And it was the only thing everybody was talking about the next day. And of course, what they were saying was, this is not going to be good news. This is a portent, this is an omen of something bad. And of course, 9 months later, the Civil War started. And a lot of people said, of course it did. Remember the comment? Absolutely it did. Now, when the Civil War started, none of the Booth family really were interested in politics except John Wilkes. He gave some thought to becoming a Confederate soldier, but his mother absolutely flipped out. She had already lost 3 children from illnesses, and she was not about to lose a 4th, particularly the one that who she said was the most devoted to her and the most caring for her and the most loving to her. And, she just said, she cried, prayed, wept. I mean, she put on every pressure a mother can put on, and she won. She won. He agreed not to join the Confederate Army, but it later seemed that was not much of a victory because, he felt guilty for not doing what his instincts told him in 1861 when he owned this Confederate flag. This is, interesting enough, John Wilkes Booth's personal Confederate flag. It's early in the war, as you can see, because it's only 11 stars. It's now the American Civil War Museum in Richmond, what they used to call the Museum of the Confederacy. So he stayed north and he acted. Lincolns were elected to the presidency, came in 61 with 3 sons. This is the middle son. This was Willie Lincoln, who in early 62 died of typhoid fever. He was 11 years old at the time. Now, of course, now the Lincolns have lost 2 sons, and this one, of course, was a really, I can't say the loss of one is more than another, but this was the son that had all the good features of the mother and the father combined. He was talented, he was gentle, he was intelligent, he was kind, he was friendly, he was whip smart. This was the son that stood out, and the loss was very, very severe. Now, the Lincolns brought in ministers to console them. This is one who came in, a Unitarian minister, Francis Pierpont. If the Pierpont name sounds familiar, this is J. Pierpont Morgan's grandson. So this is J.P. Morgan's grandson on his mother's side. But Pierpont, at this period of life, had gotten into spiritualism, as had another intimate of the Lincoln family, Isaac Newton. Now, please do not confuse this guy with Sir Isaac Newton, the genius. I mean, there's a great deal of difference. In fact, he was very marginally educated and always messing up language, He was a simple farmer who all of a sudden found himself Commissioner of Agriculture because Mary Lincoln liked it, and she insisted that her husband appoint him to some office. And Lincoln jokingly said, well, I'll make him a major general. Ms. Lincoln said, I mean a job. You know, I don't mean, I'm serious. He's got to have a job. So really, you know, it sounds credible, but due to the badgering of Mrs. Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln appointed Isaac Newton to Commissioner of Agriculture. While his lack of education may not have been his fault, it was his misfortune. Once he was up before Congress, and the congressman said, the spending of your department has been exorbitant. Newton said, thank you very much. We've worked on that. I mean, you know, he just was way over his head with these people, but he was a kind-hearted Quaker. He meant well. Everybody liked him. He was social, he was gossipy, and he was a spiritualist too. So with Pierpont, with Newton, Mrs. Lincoln would go to seances after the death of the beloved Willie. She particularly saw the woman sitting at the piano. I'm going to show you a few images from spiritualist literature of the 1890s. We have to understand it's coming from the spiritualist community. The woman at the piano is Belle Miller. Belle was what's called a test medium. A test medium could actually do stuff like move a chair across the room. I mean, they could show you physically that they were working with the spirits and these spirits were making things happen. Belle's specialty was making a piano move. And according to spiritualist lore, Lincoln tried to sit on it and hold it on the floor, not too successfully as we can see. The most prominent, I might rephrase that. The person we have the most information about as a spiritualist who met with the Lincolns was this little person. Her name is Nettie Colburn. She wrote a book in 1891 about her experiences with the Lincolns. And so we have these images from it, and we have her take of what happened. Nettie was petite. In fact, she was one of those people that, you know, they're small and slight, and you just want to kind of reach out and pat them on the head. You know, you want to reach out and touch them, as Lincoln is doing here. But as I say, I don't know, it's probably a comment on the illustrator, but if you compare Nettie on the left with Nettie on the right, she's growing, or Lincoln is shrinking. I don't know which one of those it is. But at any rate, we get to see a good bit about their experiences. Nettie was a trance medium. In other words, she would go in for a seance. Here's Nettie with the Lincolns, another set of images. And she would lapse into a trance. And then a spirit would, she said, would speak through her. It could be an Aztec Indian princess from long ago. Lincoln's favorite was an old quaint New England doctor who had been dead for a generation. And he would come out and tell stories and give Lincoln advice. But it lets us notice something, these illustrations. Nobody's sitting in a circle. Nobody's holding hands. There are no skulls. There are no candles. You know, these seances were held in brightly lit rooms during a day as bright as today, or at night in a room lit with gas light and fireplaces. And they could be social occasions. People would chit-chat. There'd be, some poetry. Someone would play the piano. Then the spirit would move over Nettie, and she would go into her seance, and usually talk for about an hour. She would always say that when she came out of a seance, she had no idea what she had said. Everybody would be staring at her with their mouths open, and she would have no. So I don't even know what happened. You tell me. I said it, but I don't know what it was. That was her take of this. Now, don't think spiritualists in this time were without their critics. There certainly were. Traditional Christians criticized them. Other reformers criticized them. Basically, it was an attack from two directions. One, this is as silly as it gets. I mean, this stuff is not happening. I don't know what they're doing. They're acting. This is a performance. This is a play. But whatever they're doing, this isn't real. It's certainly not otherworldly. And so we see this depiction criticizing spiritualism. You can see that the people at the seance table essentially are portrayed as dumb clucks, ready to be plucked by a wolf-type charlatan who's the medium at the end of the table on the left. The other criticism was, what is this stuff? This isn't Christian. This is not proper. You know, God and the Bible give a perfectly good explanation of what happened to you when you die. If it's not immediately comforting emotionally, I'm sorry about that. Everyone will feel that pain. But, you know, this is not Christian. This isn't scriptural. And you know, this is probably diabolic. You know, probably the devil is behind this stuff. Now, people like Nettie Colburn and indeed Mrs. Lincoln considered themselves perfectly acceptable Christians. You know, they went to church every Sunday while going to seances at the same time and never thought there was anything wrong with it. This very attractive young lady is Molly Devlin. She was the wife of Edwin Booth. Edwin had lost his call, lost it. And Molly died in 1863, pregnant with their child. And this plunged the Booth family into the world of spiritualism. They began to go to seances, John Wilkes, indeed, with his brother Edwin. In fact, one friend of John Wilkes Booth said that John Wilkes Booth's mind was a haunted house. That was the kind of nice way that he expressed that. But the Booths went to see a number of spiritualists, including this character, Charles Foster. He was a trance and test medium. And I might say about Foster, he also went to see the Lincolns. Mary Lincoln was very fond of him. So we have, and I developed this in the book, it was one of the things I enjoyed very much developing in the book, that Charles Foster would meet with the Lincolns, then 2 weeks later, he's meeting with the Booth family. So there was a connection, right? Although the number of spiritualists were hundreds and hundreds, the actual number of, nationally famous and super important spiritualists were more limited, like people like Charles Foster. John Wilkes Booth loved the Davenport brothers. These were remarkable physical or test mediums. Their bit was to be tied up tightly, placed into a cabinet. The cabinet would be tied and sealed. You would sit in the audience, and music would come out of the cabinet. You'd pop open the doors, there the brothers sit, still tied just like you left them. Now, everyone was saying, how are they doing that? They were saying that the spirits are providing, Beethoven's Ode to Joy. I hope you enjoyed it, right? I mean, they were applying the music for you. Harry Houdini, who needs no introduction as a name, I'm sure at least, later met with one of the brothers when the brother was retired in old age. And he said that they were the most amazing magicians that he had ever seen. Their ability to get out of ropes and ties, that one of them had a hand that he could lay like flat back on his arm. They were absolutely amazing at their ability to do prestidigitation. But this indeed was John Wilkes Booth's favorite spiritualist pair. One kind of bizarre story, this is, when I first heard it, I thought, this can't be true, but we have it in the words of Robert Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's son, his own words, in which he said that Edwin Booth, John Wilkes' brother, saved his life in 1864. Edwin was at a train station, and Robert was too. Robert was waiting for the train to Washington, and the crowd, scrummed him forward, into that gap between the train and the platform. And Robert said, I was in a very serious way of getting gravely injured, or maybe more than injured. And somebody reached out and grabbed me and pulled me back. And that was John Wilkes Booth's brother, Edwin. So oddly enough, John Wilkes Booth's brother, Edwin, saved the life of Abraham Lincoln's oldest son in 1864. This is Charles Colchester, an English immigrant to the United States who became a medium at the time of the Civil War. He's a very interesting character. He's charming, he's smart, he's talented, but he was totally unscrupulous. He was a very hard drinker, and he was unstoppable. He was somebody like if you gave them any attention, they just fed on that, and it got worse and worse. I'm reminded of that story, Richard Strauss, the composer. He was giving advice to a young conductor one time, and he told the conductor, whatever you do, he told the conductor, don't look at the trombones. It only encourages them. So I think that's exactly what Colchester was like, right? You had to be careful giving him any attention. But Mrs. Lincoln got intrigued with his seances and began to go to them. And she brought him into the White House to meet with Lincoln. Colchester, in fact, was nationally famous. This is one of his advertising bits. a modest statement of his abilities. Mrs. Lincoln brought him into the White House, and he totally mystified the president and the first lady by his ability to produce sounds out of a wall. And that this was a message from their dead son, Willie. How was he? Lincoln, in fact, didn't know what to make of that. And he said, look, Lincoln told Colchester, do me a favor, go over to the Smithsonian. This is the castle, right, the original building on the mall. I want you to meet with Joseph Henry, the Smithsonian secretary. Do for him what you're doing for me. And I want to see what Henry, who's a very distinguished scientist, would have to say about this. This is Joseph Henry, first secretary of the Smithsonian. Unfortunately for Colchester, Henry was an expert on acoustics. That's actually what his specialty was, right, as a scientist. And notably critical of sciences. And so Colchester went through his routine, and Henry said, I don't know what you're doing. I know you're doing it. I don't know how you're doing it. I don't know how you're making those sounds. So Henry had to report back to Lincoln, I'm sorry to say I can't explain what I'm hearing from this guy. I'll tell you later on what that actually was. But at the same time, Mrs. Lincoln, now this is Mary 61-ish or so, with the lamented Willie on the left and the youngest boy, Tad, on the right. Once Tad died, she began to meet with Colchester, as I said, and this began to get out of hand. As you could guess, in a seance, you had to reveal a good bit about yourself. And that could be used by unscrupulous people, like Colchester. They could be used by unscrupulous people to blackmail you. So Colchester told Mrs. Lincoln if she didn't pony up him a pass to ride free on the railroads, he would tell everybody what she had been saying to him. And she was horrified, and so she called in Noah Brooks, who was a California journalist very close to the family. He confronted Colchester in the White House and said, you're a fraud, I know it, you know it, get out of town. If you're in town this time, tomorrow you'll be in a military prison. And of course, now again, Brooks was a journalist. He didn't have the power to put anybody anywhere. But he was smart enough to know that, Mrs. Lincoln and the president and the others in the White House did. So he promptly blipped out of town about as fast as he could go. And in fact, that was good because he had become a very close friend of John Wilkes Booth. Oddly enough, at the time he's meeting with the Lincolns, he's hanging out and drinking with John Wilkes Booth, who got him a gig at Ford's Theater in a play. So that is a very close connection. And Colchester, in fact, warned Lincoln that he really needed to take care of himself. Now, I think the Colchester, I'll put it this way, he graduated in misdemeanors, not felonies. What Booth was talking about was over his head. That's too heavy for me, right? I don't mind swindling dimes out of people, but, I can't shoot anybody. And he had been warning Lincoln for months, take care of yourself. And it's unfortunate Lincoln received many such warnings. The one he should have listened to, he let pass by. But the police were very interested in Colchester after the murder. And I found this document at the National Archives. It's from the police investigations into the assassination, saying that Colchester was an associate of Booth. I won't read the whole thing, but I will just make a passing comment. You've heard the remark, I hear it very often, that people are going to forget how to read cursive before very long. Right? That's going to become a lost art. I remember I wrote on a paper something, and a student came up after class, what does this say? And I looked at what I'd written in the margin. I said, that says good job, good job. It didn't seem too challenging, but I won't ask you to struggle with that. I'm sure some of you can read it readily. But it's just a description of Colchester when the police were looking for him. But of course, on the day of the murder, he was non-est. Don't think he disappeared entirely. He went up to Buffalo, New York, where he was arrested because he wouldn't pay government taxes. Now, he said, you can't tax me. I'm a minister. Spiritualism offers an alternative view, just like the churches, of the afterlife and our relation with the future. And if you can't tax a minister, you can't tax me. That spiritualism is protected by the First Amendment. and therefore, you know, I can't be taxed. And there was a 4-day trial. It was a real hoot. As a matter of fact, they subpoenaed Grant to come to the trial. To nobody's surprise, Grant failed to show up to this circus thing, which was held in Buffalo, New York. Jurors were chronically late. Dog fights broke out in the courtroom. People were screaming at each other. But at the end of the day, Colchester was found guilty of defrauding the government for taxes. So he promptly drifted off west, about which more in just a minute. I will say, though, the war was coming to an end, as we know, in '65. This is an image of Lincoln with an axe. He may have hewn logs, but he was a pretty good chopper of vampires, as you know, also. And he was proving to be a very determined person. What do I mean by determined in his war for reunification? I'm reminded of a story of Russ Grimm, who was an offensive lineman for the team now called the Washington Commanders. Russ said one time, to win the Super Bowl, I would run over my own mother. His teammate Matt Millen said, I know that sounds hard, but I think most of us feel the same. Matt said, to win the Super Bowl, I would run over Russ's mother also. You know? So, I mean, determined. That's what I mean when I say determined. But if he was determined to unify the South with the North again, Booth was equally determined not to let that happen. The murder of Lincoln is a whole separate program, and I could just say about it that Booth had taken a very strong personal hatred of Lincoln. It wasn't even so much the North. It was almost like that he held Lincoln responsible for every bad thing that had happened in the country. And when Lincoln was elected for second term, remember, there were no term limits in 1864-65. So Lincoln could have as many terms as he could be elected to, and Booth feared, somewhat irrationally, of course, that Lincoln was trying to become a king. So Booth began to plot against Lincoln. Now, here's one of those photos where I think we look at photos, we like it, we produce it in a book, but I think we should really study them a little more in terms of fashion, in terms of, you know, just things you can see when you take a hard look. And look at this familiar photo of Booth. That ring right there. It's in the form of a snake. No one has ever pointed that out before. He found this stone on a hike of a mountain in New Hampshire and had a snake-like pattern. He wore it, had it made into a ring, wore it, and he said when he wore the ring, it was like an occult power took over him. That was what Booth had to say about it. So he begins to plot, at first just to kidnap Lincoln, failing that, finally to murder him, which was done, as we all know, at Ford's Theater in April of 1865. Now this problematic image by someone who never saw the murder, of course, but it's a scene from a fan made in Havana for the Latin American market and the European market. You'll notice devils around the image, central image, urging Booth on. And one thing about this fan is it has, you'd have to see one to appreciate this, it has a 4-inch knife concealed in it. So you give it to your daughter when she goes out on a date with that guy. And if he's as problematic as he looks and she gets in trouble, she can whip out a knife, to take care of that problem. They don't take the murder weapon out of the case very often. I was always glad when I get to hold it. Not too many people get to get their hands on that thing. It's small enough to be concealed in a good-sized hand. It's got a cast-iron barrel. It's very top-heavy. It is a single-shot weapon, as you probably know, right? One shot, and you're one and done. Once you shot, as Booth did, just drop it on the floor. You're not going to have time to reload or anything like that. So there is the Derringer that was used in the assassination. Booth was on the run for 12 or so days, finally cornered, shot through the neck, lingered, died. Very hard death. Anybody who wanted pound for pound flesh revenge got it with Booth's death. I mean, he died much, much harder than Lincoln did. In fact, one of the doctors there said, I can't imagine I've ever seen a harder death than Booth had, because he was unable to breathe, basically, in the normal way, but he gasped, and survived for a couple of hours before he finally just exhausted himself and passed away. Booth is, by the way, one of the most identified bodies of the 19th century. You know, he was given a formal autopsy by doctors. This idea that Booth escaped, you know, unfortunately is totally bogus. I mean, the body they autopsied had Booth's tattoo, had Booth's diary, you know, Booth's jewelry, Booth's ring, you know, I don't know what else you need to have. Plus, he was a nationally known figure. He was known on sight by a lot of people. 2 of the 3 detectives who were there with the group that caught him, they knew him on sight anyway. So there's no doubt that they got the man that they were looking for. And finally turned the body over to the Booth family about 4 years after the war. He was taken to Greenmount Cemetery in Baltimore, Maryland. The body went right through that gate and was buried in the Booth family plot. That's me standing on the spot where he's buried. Now, the monument to my left, that's the Booth family monument. His dad and mom are buried there, a brother there, a sister there, other people there in the family. Booth has no individual marker. Booth has no individual marker. That's because, not because the government required it, but his brother Edwin, whom I've spoken of in the earlier presentation, it suited his sensitivities. He thought it might be a flashpoint for trouble, you know, if they put a marker to him. But that's where he's buried, right at that spot there. Now, over the years, something has developed, this thing about putting Lincoln pennies on the Booth grave. You can't go up there without seeing them. People that like Booth brush the pennies off onto the ground. Later Vista puts them back up there. Of course, there's no John Wilkes marker to target, so they're put on his mom, his dad, his sister, brother. They're put around the plot. And they're put face up generally, which to me shows, as I put in the book, that I guess Lincoln won the battle of history when you come down to it. Now, to conclude, and I thank you very much for your patient attention, to conclude, this is Keokuk, Iowa. It is the place where Colchester wound up. You know, after the trial and everything in the East, he had, you know, lost his traction in our part of the country, so he moved out west. He gave performances in hotels and taverns and private homes, but unfortunately got a fever and died in the city and is buried in Oakland Cemetery in Keokuk. But I might say there's no individual marker for him. Colchester has no marker. Being an indigent stranger, I'm not surprised he doesn't really have a marker, but I might say there may be another reason. There's a ghoulish tradition that not being a local person and having no connections, he might have fallen afoul of the medical students at the local college who needed a research specimen for dissection class. And so, the story in Keokuk is they might have gone out there and dug him up and hauled him back to the anatomy lab for investigation. But that was the end, perhaps, of Charles J. Colchester. Lastly, this image of Ford's Theater. When we go to Ford's Theater today, everything we see in Ford's Theater is a reconstruction. You know, the building was grabbed by the government after the murder. They paid the Fords for it finally. The interior was remodeled into an office space, into several floors, and you can see where the floors were. In 1893, in June of 93, as floors filled with clerks were at work, the top floor gave way. It fell on 4-3, which fell on 2-1 and down, everything down into the cellar. You know, an agonizing mass of people, desks, plaster, wood, steel, all tumbled down at the front end of what's now inside Ford's Theater, killing about 20 clerks, injuring many, many more. Now, oddly enough, at the moment this happened, Edwin Booth's funeral in New York was taking place. They were taking Edwin Booth's body down Fifth Avenue for the funeral service at the very instant that Ford's Theater back in Washington collapsed. And many people thought, you know, there's another link, indeed, between the Lincolns and the Booths. Well, thank you very much for your kind attention. Did we want to take a question, if there are any? If you ever give a speech and there are no questions, old teacher's trick is, that's fine. If there are no questions, you just say, that's what every teacher wants, perfect understanding. But I'll be glad to take a question if anyone has one. Perfect understanding. Thank you very much. Feel free to ask me up front if you want. Thank you. Oh, we do have one, okay.
Is there any indication that President Lincoln, that any of his official governmental actions were influenced by the spiritualists that he consulted with?
The spiritualists always claimed that they brought about the Emancipation Proclamation. You know, that was their main claim to fame. And I think, no particular act. I think they just kind of encouraged a progressive agenda. You know, their spirits, Nettie spirits would talk about the condition of the freedmen, for example, or urged Lincoln to visit the soldiers, for example. So, you know, those are probably things he would have done even if there wasn't such a movement of spiritualism. That would be the best answer I could give. Thank you. Okay, well, thank you very much again. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here this afternoon, and Terry, thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. That's pretty fascinating to hear about the connections between Booth and Lincoln, and a little eerie at the same time. So thank you so much for being
Thank
here,
you.
for coming back to Mississippi State, and Chief, thank you for inviting Terry to be here with us today. Before we adjourn, we do have a small token of our appreciation, actually a large token of our appreciation that we would like to present to you. This is a gift that we like to give our Williams lecture speakers, and I'm going to ask the Chief to tell you a little bit about it. Why don't we walk over there to it?
Okay, go ahead.
Chief, do you want to give them? Okay, maybe I should do this. Chief, do you want to tell them about the print?
Sure, why don't we cover it for Terry?
Okay, all right.
Terry, this is a signed Fritz Eichenberg print of Lincoln, of course, from our collection. As long as we have them, we'll give them to lecturers like you who were kind enough to come and speak. But one should know that this has become the brand of the Frank and Virginia Williams collection long before our gift to state. And Fritz Eichenberg is a renowned engraver who migrated from Germany during the Nazi upheaval there for and its anti-Semitic actions in the 30s. And this, on the eve of World War II, for the greatest generation, Fritz made this for America to see the determination of our Civil War president. And that's why he may look grim, but he's also got hope and resilience that got us through the Civil War, with a hope that his spirit would get us through, as he did, World War II. So Fritz became a good friend of ours, Virginia's and mine, became the chair of the art department at the University of Rhode Island. That's how we got to know him, and he was a valued client for the years that we knew him. So we hope you'll appreciate that engraving in print that we're presenting to you now.
Thank you very much, Frank. Thank you very much.
If you'd like to come up and study the print, you'll notice that in his eye there's also a cross there. So again, Terry, thank you so much for being here with us. And thank all of you for being here with us today as well. We do have books on sale that we'd like for you to purchase, and Terry will be signing books and join us for the reception. Thank you for being here.